Sego, it is November 20th, 2017. Welcome to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people and look back at our glorious and our grave history. A tough look at where we're at now and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast on the Gwe, CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com, and that's where you can listen to crystal clear audio via the internet. Of course, we are also streaming live on Facebook, so I encourage you to check out this show on our Facebook group page, Let's Talk Native, and I'd be happy to look for your comments on Facebook as well. I am John Kane. I'm the show's host and producer, and I'm joined by Jake Proud in studio. He's actually on the board, and he is behind the camera for our live streaming and for our YouTube video that we will present this show on our own channel, that is, on Let's Talk Native TV. That is our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to subscribe to our channel. That way you'll get notifications when we put up new videos, not just the videos of the show, but the videos we do on any number of subject, a range of subject matter, and if you look for that, you'll find some interesting stuff there as well. Our studio engineer is Kelly McMillan. I want to thank her for the fine work that she's done in setting our system up here. The opening song was by Jimmy Wolf, and that's Hellhound on My Tail. I had the pleasure of seeing Jimmy just was it last weekend? Yeah, it was last weekend, and it was a great show along with Blackfoot, and it was a good time. So my wife and I enjoyed ourselves immensely, and of course it's always good to catch up with good friends like our friend Jimmy Wolf. So look, I want to have a different conversation, one we haven't really had before. You know, I see a lot of stuff on Facebook, and I across Native territories all over. I see problems in every territory, and a lot of times what you hear is people complaining, and they're complaining about their quote unquote leadership or their representation. They're claiming about the status of their governing structure, whether it's traditional enough, elective system versus traditional system, whether those traditional systems are really following. Like in our case, are these Haudenosaunee territories who claim to be following the Guyana-Dagoa really following the Guyana-Dagoa? There's those kinds of conversations. There's corruption that is alleged in so many territories, and there may be some, but what you see on Facebook is a constant drumbeat of those folks that will criticize without offering solutions. And among the criticisms that I oftentimes will hear, we'll hear people say, well, we're not really sovereign. And I wonder, is there an understanding of what that word means? Because what are they saying when they say that? Because I've heard some people say, well, we're not really sovereign because the state has jurisdiction. Yeah, but do they? Or are we conceding that, or is that true? Or I hear other people say, well, we're not really sovereign because we accept federal funds or state funds, or we allow the state and federal government to dictate this or to dictate that. And, I'm not quite so sure that I agree with that. Look, I'm not suggesting that any territory is doing enough to assert their sovereignty. And, and of course I think we have to pick and choose our battles sometimes because, we aren't in a circumstance to claim independence or self-sustainability. But you know what? Who is? I mean, look at the debt that the United States, that China carries of the U.S. debt. Look at how much places like Israel gets billions of dollars from the United States. Are they sovereign? Look at the other nations that are getting financial support from various other countries. The question isn't about whether we receive funding from the United States or New York State or any place else. The question is, do we have the authority to make our own decisions? we can talk about what sovereignty means, and oftentimes there's a debate on the word, right? There's a debate on whether that word is even appropriate for us to use. I mean, it's a French word. Its origins are based on, this whole notion that God himself, right? God himself bestowed certain authority on the sovereign, on the the man that represents God himself, right? The royal family, the king, the throne, the crown. I think, frankly, it's one of the biggest lies ever told. The idea that that a king is God on earth, God in flesh. I mean, come on, what kind of bullshit is that? But that's the way hierarchy was created. Now, native people, native territories, we've kind of adopted that word, and the word sovereignty has been, entered into our lexicon, as they say. We use that word constantly. We talk about, in fact, they'll put the word tribal in front of it. They'll call it tribal sovereignty, and that's kind of a mechanism the federal government uses to say, well, we're going to stick a word in front of it, so it doesn't really mean sovereignty. It means something less than that. It's kind of like what was the expression? Genocide, when Murray Sinclair in Canada said, well, the residential schools were they represented cultural genocide. Well, why did you put the word cultural in front of it? What was wrong with just calling it what it is? It's genocide. Well, it's the same thing when we use things like sovereignty or self-determination. There's always these words that others try to manipulate so it means something else. The question is, what are we doing? Are we buying into this notion? I mean, it would be very easy for white people to say, well, you're not sovereign. You guys have, the state has roads through your territory. Yeah, but how does that diminish our sovereignty? But we start to buy into that stuff. I mean, I see stuff on Facebook all the time. I see people saying, a friend of mine posted the other day, says, what do you fight for? And somebody's, another friend of mine said, the something along the lines of the fake notion of sovereignty. No, that's not what I fight for. I don't fight for the illusion of sovereignty. I'll tell you what I fight for. I fight for my grandchildren and my children and my grandchildren, so that they will be able to accomplish a little bit more with each generation. Look, we can look at what's been done in the past, and we know that lands have been lost. We know that the state has kind of had its way, and the federal government's had its way with us at various times in our history, right? But some of that stuff doesn't have any legal foundation. So we still have the opportunity to fight. I mean, this whole notion of decolonization, that is something that we need to promote. Sovereignty isn't a gift. And sovereignty isn't just about whether the federal government recognizes that sovereignty or not. Because clearly they don't. I mean, the first time, white man landed on the shores of Turtle Island, they proclaimed that they were the sovereigns, that God had given this land to them simply because they washed up on our shores. Now, we can buy into that bullshit, or we can resist it. So when I see people say, well, we're not sovereign because we get federal funds, that just frustrates me. I mean, because we're buying into what they're saying. We're buying into this notion of conquest that never happened, of subjugation that never happened. In 1924, when the U.S. passed the Indian Citizenship Act, we can say, well, they made us citizens. Or we can say, they tried to. I mean, I don't consider myself an American citizen. I'm Ongwengwe. I'm Mohawk. Konyogeha. Haudenosaunee. I mean, there's any a number of words I could use, but at the end of the day, I don't accept the idea that the United States could just claim my sovereignty, my birthright. And for all those of you who do, man, that's just sad. And why? I mean, I don't care what a previous elected administration or tribal administration or whatever you want to call, they've, in our culture, nobody can sell out our birthright or the future birthright. What do we, when we talk about 7 generations, is that just a lie? Is that just a myth? I mean, the whole idea is that, that we're supposed to make decisions that will positively impact them. Now, the idea that we could sell out the birthright of the next generation or 2 or 3 or 7, we don't have that authority within our culture. So, frankly, it doesn't matter if somebody signed something away in a treaty. Now, I know that becomes problematic when you talk about land, but you know what? Even some of that notion is kind of crazy because the land doesn't go anywhere. So what do we do to assert our use of the land? I think about Letchworth State Park, the Gardeau Reservation. There's nothing that stops us from using that. And ultimately, I think if we had a stronger presence, if we spent a lot of time there, and especially the Senecas, because it was a Seneca territory, I think that you could arguably, lay claim to that land. And you lay claim to that land by your activity and your use of it. So, I'm really troubled by this notion that our own people say, well, we're not sovereign. It's an illusion. Man, that's frustrating. That's like giving up. That's like laying down. And that's not what I'm teaching my kids. It's not what I'm teaching my grandkids. Those are not the conversations I want to have with the people who I want to build a future with. So this is a part of my frustration. And so the question is, what are we prepared to do? Look, we can debate whether the Seneca Nation or the Tuscaroras or the Onondagas, and we can get into this whole debate. Well, they're just corporations. Whatever. That again is a defeatist attitude. It's a defeatist way of looking at, who you are and who the people are that, and you can say, well, they don't represent me. It's like Americans say, well, Donald Trump's not my president. Yeah, he is. If you're a U.S. citizen and you support that, that system of governance, then whatever it yields, if it's a moron, it's a moron. Well, and the same thing goes on our territories. Look, I would love to see genuine traditional governance come back to our territories. But I'll tell you what I see as demonstrations of traditional governance in Tonawanda and Tuscarora and Onondaga. No, thank you. No, thank you. That's not what I'd like to see come back. I'd like to see us really utilize the clan system and really utilize the voice of the people, where those people who are who are given titles are servants of the people. And and maybe there's a way to work back towards that. And I'm not talking about overthrowing elected governments or whatever else, but it's a whole idea of utilizing what I would call more culturally appropriate systems to solve problems and to build a future. We talk about schools and we talk about conflict resolution, talk about the drug problems. Look, we can get heavy-handed. We can say, well, we'll just call the cops in here. We'll use the state police or we'll use the county sheriffs to restore or to enforce law and order on our territories. No, thank you. We can create alternatives to those, to those failing systems. Because let's face it, the U.S. justice system, from townships to the federal system, is a debacle. So why would we want to use that? So the question comes back to, and we hear the word decolonization, right? Well, what are we prepared to do as individuals first? Before we approach, an administration or a governing structure within a native territory, to say, will you yield some of this to this? We got to have something in place first. So, I've talked about I've talked about the concerns that I have for the future of our environment, and when I say environment, I just don't mean the trees and the water. I mean, I mean that as well. I am concerned about climate change, but what do we do? What are we doing ourselves? I mean, not to reverse climate change, but to prepare for it, because that's part of the issue. Part of the issue is we have to recognize that the world is in a crisis. It's a tinderbox. There are many things that could go very, very wrong. Climate change is one of them. Man-made climate change, and it could disrupt everything. I mean, I go to New York every week to do my show down there, and I think about how vulnerable the Manhattan is. I mean, it's essentially an island around, surrounded by rivers. It's really, really vulnerable. And I'll tell you, New York got blasted by Hurricane Sandy. By the time it hit New York, it wasn't even a hurricane anymore. It was just, they call it Superstorm Sandy. And it did billions of dollars worth of damage. And it never even took the major hit. Jersey got hit hard, but, Long Island got some of it. But no, I mean, to tell you, if weather intensity increases, you're not just talking about Miami and these Florida cities or Gulf Coast cities like Houston or New Orleans. You're going to talk about cities like New York and Boston. And I'm not saying, well, if it's New York or Boston, we better do something about it. No, this is the crisis that we're facing: rising sea levels, higher tides. More severe storms with more radical paths than ever seen before. But what are we doing? I mean, what are we doing to secure? I mean, are we building more secure homes? Are we building more a more sustainable life? With perhaps not being bound to the grid, I mean, look, we can complain about whether the governance and the administrations on each native territory do, but what are we doing? I mean, we can take a lot of this stuff on ourselves, and we could create the models. The tiny home thing is an example. I know Seneca Nation built a couple, but until we as people, the people, start embracing some of these concepts and look at some lifestyle changes, we're not doing enough. And I'll tell you, I've said it before, there are a couple of other things that I'm really concerned about. I think the U.S. the political system is in real jeopardy. And we're going to be impacted by it. And I'm not just saying impacted by it because of federal funding. But I'll tell you, when racism, which is, being sponsored and promoted by the systems, and that's what racism is, right? Systemic racism. When it's being promoted by the governing structures, we end up being some of those brown people in the crosshairs. All this corruption that's surrounding both parties. I mean, not just the sexual harassment and sexual assault issues, but the corruption associated with both parties in terms of pay to play. I mean, look, a lot of this stuff was there for years, and it's finally getting exposed. Just like the sexual misconduct of people in power. But are we setting a better example? Or are we just going to sit around and bitch and complain about it? I mean, that ends up being the question. And I'll tell you, beyond the concern about the U.S. government, there are other governments that are really, really concerning. I mean, the world is a bit of a tinderbox in terms of violence. I mean, the ramping up of rhetoric between North Korea and the United States. I mean, whether you really believe that that the world is on the brink of a nuclear conflict or not, it's certainly possible. Especially when you got morons like Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump leading countries with these kind of weapons. And of course, you've got bystanders just waiting to cash in on the mess that happens. Places like China, Russia, other places. The world is in a very volatile state right now in terms of politics and conflict. Now, the other part that concerns me, and I've talked about this before, are our societies, the people themselves. I mean, racism is as bold an issue as it ever has been. White supremacists on the prowl. I mean, the alt right on one side, and then you got the Antifa or whatever you want to call it on the other side. I mean, this is some bizarre behavior for people to have. And if you resist things like police violence, you get labeled a terrorist group. I mean, Jeff Sessions was questioned by the Senate just the other day about trying to identify black militant groups. No, they have no reporting on white supremacy groups or militias, because that's the base of the Republican Party. But they're doing an analysis on whether Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group or not. I mean, give me a freaking break. So the social stuff is, societal stuff is really, really breaking down. Really breaking down. But again, what are we doing? Are we standing with anybody? I mean, are we, trying to assert our own pushback against racism? And look, we see some having the debate over things like Columbus statues and mascots. I mean, what's the new one I saw? Nicki Minaj. Did you see this one, Jake? Oh man, somebody took a photo and she put it on her Instagram or something like that, and it shows her licking the Netherlands, the nether regions of a Pocahontas image. And so this is the stuff that's out there in the public discourse. And you know what? I know that there's Native people who still think Nicki Minaj is just the best. And they won't turn on these people. Our own people will tolerate this kind of, racist or sexist or misogynist, view or the treatment of these cultural images. I mean, it's so. What do we do? I mean, do we just sit back and complain on Facebook? I mean, look, I do that too. I mean, I post stuff on Facebook, but I don't just do that. Obviously, I do this show to try to elevate a conversation. But there are things that we can do. We should do our own programs to promote who we are as a people. And not just angry Native people who are angry over having survived barely, in some cases, genocide. And I'm not saying put a happy face on it. I'm not talking about doing the Happy Pilgrims and Happy Indians thing for Thanksgiving. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about putting on a fake show. But what are we doing to promote the best of us? I don't mean the best individuals, but the best parts of each one of us. So this is the societal stuff, and I'll tell you the other thing that and I've talked about this before, is the potential for economic crash. It is a real concern. I mean, the global economy that everybody promotes with every college. Oh, we're preparing our young people for the global economy. I don't care about the global economy. I care about the local economy. We can't even have a meaningful conversation with the folks in Niagara Falls without the governor's permission to do so. We're not having conversations even from native to native. There is no official trade relationship from territory to territory. I mean, Seneca Nation, obviously, there's trade between Cattaraugus and Allegheny, but we don't have proper commercial and diplomatic relationships from native territory to native territory. I'm not saying that we're enemies, but what do we do to assert and strengthen and fight for the trade, native to native trade? And then go beyond that. What do we do to encourage the commerce, other than cheap prices on gas and cigarettes? What do we do to encourage the commerce to our non-native neighbors? And do more than just sell them stuff. And, we get the money in, then we turn and we buy back from them. That's and that's kind of it. I mean, but there's more that we could do. But we got to think outside the box, and we got to think about the future. And we can all sit around and complain. We can complain about whether our sovereignty has been diminished or not. Well, who diminished it? Do you think you can pinpoint a couple of quote unquote leaders When? Corn Planter, Handsome Lake, Red Jacket, Bob Porter? I don't know. Who are you thinking of? I mean, you want to blame somebody, or do we all accept a little bit of blame? That's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, what do we do? What do we do? And I think there are some solutions. I think there are some things we can do. We could be more assertive. We'd be more assertive about in the conversations and seeking solutions. You know, what is it? What do we want the relationship to be between our territories and New York State? None? Do we want some sort of cooperative agreement? I mean, what do we want that relationship with the counties or the townships? I mean, do we even have those conversations? Look, we're close to the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break and we'll come on back and we'll dig in a little deeper. Got a couple other things I want to talk about, but we'll dig in a little deeper when we come on back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native.
I said somebody, Lord, somebody's got to pay. I said somebody, yeah, Lord, somebody.
Thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Hey, I want to give some thanks out to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, individuals, friends who do what they can when they can. Guys like Ed Schindler and Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring, Sugar Montour, and the Seneca Nation. And I want to thank many others who have helped this program in the past. I mean, we're in our 8th year. So we've been doing this for a while, and for a good portion of that, we were on commercial radio buying airtime, and in order to do that, we needed help, and we wouldn't be here today in our 8th year if we didn't survive those times when we were paying some pretty hefty prices for that commercial airtime. So I want to thank all of you who have helped in the past, and we used to run ads on the show and do other kinds of sponsorships and promotions. So I want to thank all of you who have helped this program continue to educate, inform, and entertain over the years. I want to thank you all for again joining in the fight and doing your part. So I want to thank all of you. Of course, I also want to thank the Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE for both the simulcasts and the rebroadcasts, as well as Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio. And I also want to thank all of you who share the program, who either share the Facebook live streams or the SoundCloud audio posts, or the YouTube videos. I want to thank all of you for doing that. And of course, I also want to thank for those of you who offer comments, not just to the Facebook live stream, but I write and I'll post some things, and sometimes I get a rise out of people. A couple of the comments that I've issued in the past over things like racism and that kind of thing. Wow, did I get some? I got some heat on some of those. I posted that one comment. I said something about racism is so American that when we protest racism, people think we're protesting America. That was a classic, and man, I got some people kind of pissed off over that one. So interesting stuff. Look, the reason for doing the show is to have these tougher conversations, and the hope is that the conversations lead to actions, and that people will actually do something. So that's kind of the hope, and I think about. For all of the things that we can complain about, we're still here, and we're not just surviving. We really aren't. Our lives. Look, I know some native territories are in really tough shape, but not all of them. And even the ones who are in tough shape, man, there's things that come out of those territories, out of those peoples. Some tremendous accomplishments, some of it in the arts, and and of course we have the folks who go on to be doctors and lawyers and all that other stuff. But what I think about the arts in particular, and they could be visual arts, they could be performance arts, they can be theater and music and that kind of stuff. We have had influence. We have had influence on all kinds of stylizations. I think about Louis Hall and, the art that he offered and that he presented. I don't think there's a native person who paints who hasn't been influenced at some level with the Louis Hall style of and that wasn't his main thing. He was an activist. He was a warrior. And yet he influenced. And of course, then there's music. I played some more Jimmy Wolf here. Somebody's got to pay during the break. And I'm a huge fan of Jimmy Wolf. I just think his, and again, it's hard to even appreciate how good he is until you see him play live. But I play a lot of Murray Porter and John McLeod, and these are guys that I've become friends with. And I admire the fact that they use music to communicate something. But even you look historically, the impact that Native people have had on contemporary music, American contemporary music, and frankly, global music, it's significant. On November 29th, that's a Wednesday at 7:30, I'm screening a film that is the film is specifically addresses the influences that Native people have had on music. The film is called Rumble, and it's based on a guitar lick essentially by Link Ray. And so the film it's called Rumble: The Indians Who Rocked the World. We're going to screen that film at the Cinema Arts Center in Huntington, New York. That's out in Long Island, and I'm doing that on Wednesday, November 29th at 7:30 p.m. with my good friend Cindy Campbell, who is she is a producer of a show on WBAI along as well as myself, and we collaborate for these screenings out at the Cinema Arts Center from time to time. So we're going to screen that film, and I'm going to see what I can do to get a copy of the film so I can screen it in a couple other places. I screen films in Brooklyn at the cafe below WBAI Studios. And other places. This film is important. And in fact, I'm gonna go ahead and play the audio for the trailer for this film so you can get a sense. And I'll tell you, if you listen to this thing, you're gonna hear voices like Martin Scorsese and Stevie Van Zandt and Robbie Robertson, Buffy St. Marie. I mean, it's just filled with faces and images that Stevie Salas. I mean, guys that guys that you'll know. So let me go ahead and we'll play that trailer and come right back.
There was a song came on the radio, a guitar instrumental, and it changed everything.
Link Ray, it's rock and roll.
Rumble. Yeah, that's the one.
Rumble.
Hey, Rumble.
Rumble had the power to help me say, I'm going to be a musician.
And then I found out that he was an Indian.
The music that we know here in the United States is fully supported by input from Native and Indigenous people.
Mr. Randy Casillo!
Randy had become one of the most influential heavy metal drummers in the world.
This is Jesse Ed Davis.
I particularly fell in love with Jesse Edwin Davis. He was with Taj Mahal, and Taj's album is what spurred me to rock more.
And here's your rocking chair lady, Mildred Bailey.
From 16 to 20 years old, that's the only thing I listened to was Mildred Bailey. I just said, I want to learn how to sing like her.
Figuring out that these people were Indians, and then we started to ask ourselves, why didn't anyone else know that?
There was this key expression. Be proud you're an Indian, but be careful who you tell.
All of a sudden, I was talking about Native American issues and big-time television. And all of a sudden, everything disappeared.
From Charlie Patton to Link Ray, Robbie Robertson invented the genre. Jimi Hendrix was the best in his field. Jesse Ed Davis, everybody wanted him. Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
Gone too long under the radar.
All right, there you have it. That's Rumble, the Indians Who Rocked the World. Look, this is a perfect example of individuals who have had impact. Now, I mean, it's like Robbie Robertson said. I mean, it's tough when, in order to demonstrate and to be successful, you almost had to hide a certain amount of who you are and what your identity is. But really, that's not the world we live in anymore. I don't think we have to stay in the shadows. But again, I come back to that question: what are we doing? What are we doing? I mean, during the break here, I was looking at some of the comments, and I look at some of the ridiculous things that people say. The Haudenosaunee is dead because the wampum belts were sold. Like somehow those belts had magic in them, and that without them we cease to exist. This whole idea that we've lost our standing. It's just I don't know. It's amazing to me what people will come up with. And like I said, one of the comments talked about the word. They use the word modifiers when we stick these words in front of other words. So instead of sovereignty, we say tribal sovereignty, and instead of nations, we say tribal nations. So we don't really mean nations. Instead of people, we'll say tribal people, because it's like you can change what the second word means by putting a modifier in front of it. So when we talk about things like, self-determination, what the federal government wants to call it? They don't like the idea of Native people asserting self-determination because that has an international definition. They say, no, we mean internal self-determination. So we'll stick a modifier in the front of that thing. We talk about, again, genocide. I was angry when I saw that Murray Sinclair, in drafting the report on the Canadian side for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission associated with the residential schools, that he suggested that these schools represented cultural genocide. Many people were raving, oh, he used the word genocide. Isn't that great? I'm so glad that he was brave enough to use the word. No, he wasn't brave enough to use the word genocide. Not by itself. He had to throw a modifier in front of it. Like it was only our culture that was killed. They took away our beads and our leather craft. No, people died in those schools. So I'll tell you, I was insulted by the notion that somebody would suggest that these schools represented merely cultural genocide. And the thing is, that's not a thing. Cultural genocide doesn't exist. That's not even a concept. The definition of genocide, the international definition of genocide, suggests that if you kill a culture, that is genocide. Because anything that you do that would that would terminate or cause a people to cease to exist as a distinct people, which includes the wiping out of culture, which is that's true that these residential schools did that, but they did more than wipe out culture. They broke the bond between mother and child, father and child, grandparents and children, the children and the land that they came from. They broke. Language isn't just culture. Language has everything to do with history and identity. And of course, there was rape and murder. The mortality rate in these residential schools in Canada, it was clearly documented that it was a 50% mortality rate. Tuberculosis was allowed to run rampant. They didn't quarantine. They wanted to see how it would spread. These schools had graveyards associated with them. I say that all the time, but I can't ignore that. Now, the other thing I would be remiss to not mention it is, and I'm glad somebody mentioned it here, Hawaii. Hawaii has an absolute legal right to assert its sovereignty. That territory was completely illegally occupied by the United States. There's no question about it. In fact, the United States apologized for it. And the crazy thing is, when the United States apologized for the illegal act that they committed in the coup and the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, it was endorsed, and it was called the apology resolution. It was a joint resolution of Congress. Overwhelming support for this resolution that was passed. And the funny thing is, when Hawaiians wanted to cite that apology resolution, this joint resolution of Congress, in a legal claim that they were making involving land, the Supreme Court said joint resolutions of Congress have no legal standing. You can't cite those. Do you know how the United States claimed Hawaii? No, there was no annexation treaty. There was no deal made by the Hawaiian people. It was white guys who used the Marines to do a coup over they imprisoned Queen Liliuokalani And then they tried to put some sham of an annexation treaty together that the president rejected at the time. Grover Cleveland rejected it. But ultimately, when the Spanish-American War would break out, the United States took Hawaii, yes, with a joint resolution of Congress. Now, you don't know what the significance of that is, but let me explain the process for the United States to gain territory. There must be an annexation treaty. The people the sovereign people must ask to be annexed. And that treaty is negotiated. And then 2/3 of the Senate has to approve this treaty. Then the president can sign it, and then the annexation can take place. A joint resolution of Congress isn't 2/3 of the Senate. It's a simple majority of the House and the Senate. And there were congressmen who said this appears to be a way to do something illegal, to do something we can't do legally, which is to illegally occupy Hawaii. And that's what they did. And yet there are people in Hawaii who would rather try to apply to the Interior Department to become a tribe, subordinate to the laws of the United States. I mean, there's a strong contingency of Kanaka-Maoli, of Native Hawaiians, who say, no, you're not going to turn us into an Indian tribe and treat us the way you've treated those people. We're fighting for our sovereignty. Man, I wish there was more of that in our territories. I wish our people would do more of that. See, that's the thing. At some point, we have to be willing to shed ourselves of the the church influences, shed ourselves of the not just the financial dependency, but the dependency in general on the state and the federal government. And we can. I mean, the Seneca Nation makes enough money from its gaming operations to not be dependent on on government funding. I mean, you get into this practice of applying for grants, and then the state has influences on how the money is apportioned and spent and that kind of stuff, and how in regulating the use of those dollars. But there are territories that don't need that. The question is, what are we prepared to do? I know, when I say, look, what am I fighting for? I'm fighting for my children, my grandchildren. Now my children are grown, so I'm not so much fighting for them, but I want them, my grandkids and other children that I see, to be in a position so they can carry the fight a little farther each generation. So we claw back. I mean, previous generations, my parents' generation, they didn't fight the state much. We fight them all the time, and we got a picture hanging on the wall from 92 and 97. I mean, fighting back on the state over taxation. Man, when was the last time anybody spilled out on the thruway? I mean, we have to decide what we're willing to do. When are we willing to stand up? When are we willing to fight for something? Or are we going to sit back and complain? It was great to see 5, 6, 7, 8, 10,000 people show up at Standing Rock, but they didn't resist enough, and the pipeline got built, and there's oil flowing through it. Keystone XL pipeline. Not only is work still being done on it, I think Kansas is voting on it right now, I guess. Kansas or Nebraska or something like that. But in the meantime, 200,000 gallons of tar sands oil leaks all over, makes this huge mess in South Dakota. Are we prepared to really fight something? Fight against something and for something? Because sometimes to fight for something, you do have to fight against something. But you know what? If you're not prepared to fight against something, there are still plenty of things to fight for. Look, if our whole, if we believe what we need to do is shelter our kids, because I thought that too. I thought that, look, I don't want my kids to have to experience racism. But then I realized they have to. If they don't feel that, then they won't have the passion to resist. Every generation has to know what it is. But my job isn't just to build a big house that I can hand over to my kids. I mean, I don't know that the kids will be able to maintain the house, in 20 years. Lifestyles are going to change. I'd be better off teaching my kids to build a house, teaching my grandchildren to build homes. We need to do some soul searching, going back to some of the traditions, raising some of our own food. I know that there's more of an effort to do that, and that's one of the bright spots that we see. And I think people can get excited about that. The canning and the maple syrup and all. Look, these are all great programs, but we got to expand it. We got to do more. And we have to be more of a community. We have to do more to support each other, help each other. Yeah, it's nice when you help family, but what about neighbors? These are the things that we need to improve on. Maybe we need to dust off the clan system a little bit, so we understand that our family isn't just our immediate cousins on, maybe there's something more to that. One of the things that we do, there's a group of us that we call it holding council. We light a fire and we sit out together and we chew the fat. We tell stories and kind of catch up with stuff. There's no booze involved. I mean, we just kind of sit around and, sometimes till 2:00 in the morning. We need more of that. We need more community gatherings that aren't necessarily politically motivated, although politics may enter into the conversations, but they're more socially and they're communally oriented. That's what we need, folks. Yeah, we can complain. We can complain about what this leader did or what that leader did, but what are we doing? Do we need leaders? Or do we need to have some directions that we can give to people? This is some of the questions that we have to ask. I think it's really easy to complain. And it's real easy to buy in to what we're being fed. I saw this article, it was posted on Facebook. It had to do with a history book in Canada for elementary school. And it basically said that the First Nations people recognized that the Europeans needed space, so they gave them space to grow. So forget about the Removal Act and the extermination and the genocide. They wanted to recharacterize this whole notion for kids in school that we were just a generous people who sacrificed our lives and our land so white people could have more. Well, we need to stand up to that stuff. We say, no, that's not what happened. We need to understand our own history, and I know we talk about it all the time. We need to understand identity, and we need to assert and affirm our identity. I posted something on Facebook the other day. I said, look, I see all these people who were protesters showing up here and showing up there, and now all of a sudden they have money to travel the world. They're in Europe and they're in Australia, they're in Hawaii, and they're traveling, and I'm thinking, wow, these guys were broke just a couple of months ago. last year they were broke in Standing Rock. I don't know I don't know that that's the solution. Look, I think we need to promote who we are and tell the world our story. But I think it's another thing to try to become professional activists. The job of an activist is to build something, to dismantle the systems of oppression so we can free ourselves. It isn't just the idea of, pay to play Indians. We need to do more, and we can complain, and maybe that's a place to start. I don't think complaining is the problem. It's only complaining that's the problem. So let's build a path. Let's start doing some things, and and come up with solutions. Look, if there's something you're not happy with, whether it's governmental or whether it's social or whether it's communal, whatever it is, let's make some suggestions on how to fix it or how to address it. Maybe not fix the whole problem. Sometimes it's about creating an example. Look, some people say the show was about nothing, and look, I this is what's been bothering me this week after seeing some of those comments, seeing these comments that that somehow we have lost everything, and that we are merely a shadow of who we once were. I don't know. I think we can be shadows if that's what we choose to be, but I don't think that's what we're relegated to. I think we have a lot more power. One of the things that drew me to the Seneca Nation in particular, when I first moved here 20 years ago or whenever it was, is that the people had a bit of a spirit. Obviously we were fighting the tax battle in '97 and back then, and that's what I was encouraged by. I was encouraged by that, and and then I met families that looked like my family, and the government wasn't overbearing. Now, of course, they have gaming and they have more resources, and there might be a certain amount of tail wagging the dog, but I think there's real opportunities in many of our territories, and not the least of which here on Seneca territory. That's why I advocate. Hey, look, I support many of the policies of the Seneca Nation. I know people can criticize that, and that's why I weigh in on the battle with the state over this gaming revenue. And look, I am an advocate for Native people, and I want things to get better, and I hope that more people will put a better foot forward for solutions rather than just criticisms. Look, that just about wraps it up, folks. Look, I'm gonna record a show for my Thursday show in New York, so look for that on Thursday. We'll post up a video, and we'll have a show that's gonna be primarily a music show. It's on the American Thanksgiving, so rather than me getting into a bit of a shouting match over angry pilgrims and angry Indians, I'm just gonna take an easy ride on that day. Hopefully, people can enjoy a little bit of Native music on that day, and so we'll look for that. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native, and we'll be back on Friday. Yahweh.